Nothing but the most determined skepticism can justify this aversion to metaphysics. In this episode of Philosophers Explained by me, Stephen Hicks, we turn to David Hume's 1739 Treatise of Human Nature. Let's go to the text to see why metaphysics and philosophy more generally are in trouble and why skepticism might be justified. All right, one of the landmark works in philosophy, David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. Let's start by noticing the date of publication, 1739, and its significance, obviously in the middle part of the age of the Enlightenment, as historians and philosophers have come to call the long 1700s. It's also interesting that Hume marks a midway point between John Locke philosophically and Immanuel Kant philosophically. And it's interesting that the dates match. So 50 years earlier, exactly in 1689, John Locke had published his optimistic, aspirational, foundational work in Empiricism and Enlightenment philosophy more broadly in 1689. So this, in one reading of the history of philosophy, is to take that optimistic tradition and see it reaching a pessimistic, skeptical point by the time we get 50 years later to David Hume. And then 50 years later, in the decade of the 1780s, Immanuel Kant is going to be publishing his Critique of Pure Reason. And so between Locke and Kant is 100 years, and this work is exactly halfway in that development, from the optimistic pro-Enlightenment, pro-empiricism of John Locke to the skeptical and more subjective turn that we find in Immanuel Kant 100 years later. David Hume marks a landmark, a turning point, both a reflection on what has happened to the optimism of the empiricism of Locke to necessitate, by many philosophers' estimations, the turn, the Copernican revolution that we find in Kant. But let's plunge into the text. So here is Hume in the introduction to the treatise, reflecting on what is a sorry state of philosophy, right? And this is his diagnosis. Principles taken upon trust, just trust me, consequences lamely deduced from them, want of coherence of the parts and of evidence in the whole. These are everywhere to be met in the systems of the most eminent philosophers, and seem to have drawn disgrace upon philosophy itself. So from the aspirations, and even now at what we think of as the height of the Enlightenment, Hume is sounding a dark, skeptical note. Things are not as they seem, even among the best of the philosophies that we have right now. So as a result of this, nothing but the most determined skepticism, along with a great deal of indolence, can justify this aversion to metaphysics. So metaphysics as a foundational discipline in philosophy, the aversion to the kind of metaphysics that is being practiced as skepticism is going to be justifiable in response to that. So why so? Now, as we turn into the text, the first book of the text, the treatise as a whole is divided into 3 books. You'll notice I've got some quotations along the way that we're going to read and comment upon, but you'll see after each of them a notation like this that marks the book, chapter, section, and subsection, so you can check them out for yourself in the treatise. So where does and should philosophy start? Now, the empiricist line that has been developed wants to say that reason should be based on the senses. The senses provide our basic point of contact with reality, and then on the basis of that we go on to build our intellectual systems. And that's the position called empiricism. So here's Hume's description of empiricism. An impression first strikes upon the senses and makes us perceive heat or cold, thirst or hunger, pleasure or pain of some kind or other. Of this impression, there is a copy taken by the mind, which remains after the impression ceases, and this we call an idea. So, pausing at this point, what we have then is the senses, and then something outside that is impressing upon the senses. And then we have a perception, right? And we can call these impressions cold, heat, etc. Now, what we then introduce is what we now sometimes call memory, right? Which is a copy of that impression, and the mind stores that. So we have something outside doing impressing, and we have the mind that is impressed upon, and it is by means of the senses. The senses give us immediate experiences, these immediate perceptions, but then we also have copies of them that get stored in the mind. Now, carrying on, this idea of pleasure or pain, when it returns upon the soul, produces the new impressions of desire and aversion, hope and fear, which may properly be called impressions of reflection, because derived from it. So there's something out there, impresses upon our senses. We have perceptions of heat, cold, right, and so forth. We remember those in the mind or in the soul. When those are recalled, we have then new impressions that cause then further experiential states of hope, fear, etc. And those we call impressions of reflection. So we already have an initial taxonomy of what's going on in the basic intercourse between mind or soul. At this point, maybe those are just to be meant synonymously and some sort of impressing source for that we might call an external world. All right, so that's the basic empiricist commitment that Hume thinks is correct, and we're going to work within this, but we're going to be careful. And in order to be careful, we then have to say, well, once we start getting away from all of these initial impressions and we start to talk about all of the other things that go on in the mind or in the soul, what is the nature of those things? Now here, Hume then introduces what we now call nominalism. Now, nominalism is a position about the nature of the abstractions or the general ideas that we have in our minds and their relation to reality. And there are a number of positions, obviously, that philosophers have taken over the ages, because it seems like at first blush we might say that we have these various abstract and general ideas in our minds. So I have an impression of humanity in general, or humans in general. So yes, I might know there are lots of particular human beings out there, and they are all impressing upon me differently because they have different sizes, shapes, smells, colors, and so forth. But nonetheless, I also have this more general or abstract idea of humans in general, and that's not reducible to being identical to my impression of any particular human being. Now, that position, though, has philosophical history, but also been debated hotly by those who want to argue that, in fact, we don't have any genuinely abstract ideas in mind or any genuinely general ideas in our minds. Instead, what is in our minds are particular ideas that are just as particular as the impressions, and that it's perhaps an illusion or just a loose way of talking to say that in some sense they are general or abstract. So let's read Hume here, and then we will talk about why this is so important and controversial. So Bishop Berkeley, a slightly earlier philosopher working in the empiricist tradition, often standard history of philosophy textbooks will start with Bacon, Locke, work through Berkeley, and then end with Hume as a culmination of this empiricist line of thought. But Hume is going to agree with Berkeley on this point. All general ideas are nothing but particular ones annexed to a certain term. I'm going to pause right there. So that is to say, there are no really abstract ideas or universal ideas or universal concepts, right, in our mind. They are simply particular ideas that have a tag, a word, a linguistic term attached to them. annexed to a certain term which gives them a more extensive signification and makes them recall upon occasion other individuals which are similar to them. Now I'm going to pause here and say a little more about the general context here. When we say, for example, that human beings are whatever, mortal beings, what do we mean when we use this term or this phrase, human? And we want to say, for example, that all humans are, say, equally human, or they're all the same in their humanity, and we use that more abstract designator. Now here we have an issue, because when we look at particular human beings, I might see my brother over here, my friend over here, my wife over here, they are all particular human beings, and along every particular dimension that I am aware of, they are different from each other. Right? They differ in size, shape, smell, etc., and so forth. So if I want to say that they are all humans and they're all, say, equally or identically or the same in their humanity, what do I mean that? What am I picking out here? And then some traditional philosophies had said that what we talk about, this generalization, right, or this abstractness, exists independently of our minds out there. There really are, in addition to all of the particular features of the individual humans, a general humanity or an essence or something like that that exists in them, and they all have exactly that same general abstract essence in them. And that what our minds are doing is, of course, receiving all of the particularities from them, but also receiving this more general abstract essence as well. So that there's two elements here. This is what Hume is denying. There is no real general abstract essence or anything like that out there. There are particulars that are out there. The impressions that come into our mind are also particulars. And what we call this general abstract idea really is just a bunch of different particular things that are more or less similar in certain respects. And so we are putting them in a category and affixing a term to it. And this position is called nominalism, and it's distinguished from any sort of abstract realism. And there are various versions of abstract realism that are out there. Hume is also denying that another position that wants to say that out there in reality are particular things with all of their particularity, but what our minds do is perform an operation that we would call abstraction, where we create a new kind of mental entity that is general or abstract in itself, and that general idea then serves to integrate all of the particulars. There is no actual new abstract kind of identity or object in our mind. Instead, the ideas themselves are particular. So this position of nominalism, I'm emphasizing this because this is important. So what we have then is an empiricism. All impressions come into the mind. We make copies of them, we recall them, and we might do various things, but everything then is an empirical impression or a memory or reflection of one of those, and everything is particular. That's the nominalism. Now, since all ideas are derived from impressions and are nothing but copies and representations of it, nothing but copies and representations of it, whatever is true of the one must be acknowledged concerning the other. So if things out there in reality are particular, all of our ideas then are particular. There are no real abstractions or essences or anything like that. Impressions and ideas differ only in their strength and their vivacity, not in their abstractness or their particularity. So, putting those two foundational points together, Hume is going to do a lot of work and draw out the sometimes surprising skeptical implications of this foundational approach to philosophy. Now, what Hume then wants to say is, as philosophers, we need to be careful. And one of the hazards of doing philosophy is that we start talking about all sorts of very abstract general ideas, big picture ideas, and spinning huge webs of ideas and theories and having arguments, right, and so forth. What Hume wants to argue is, before any particular idea that we are considering, or system of ideas or arguments, whether we think about whether it's true or not and plunging into those arguments, we have to always ask a more basic question. Do we know what we are talking about when we are using a particular idea, when we are using a particular word? And if we do know what we are talking about, what we will be able to do is point out the ideas that are based on certain impressions that give rise to that idea. And if, when we start talking about various words and we're throwing them around and building systems on the basis of them, and we cannot point out the impressions that give rise to those ideas, we are using meaningless terms, and we should not be doing that. So we always have to ask, what impression is this idea based on? Or any given word or any constellation of words, break them down to the constituent elements and always be able to tie them back to the impressions. That's the empiricist criterion of meaning. If we can't do that, we are talking nonsense. We are talking meaninglessness, and we should not go any further and even ask questions about truth and other kinds of significance. Now, what we're going to do then is take this empiricist criterion of meaning, the empiricism plus the nominalism, and apply it to many of the important concepts that philosophers use. And Hume is going to argue that we've been using them much too loosely, and that in fact many of these concepts are in fact meaningless and should be dispensed with. Now let's start with some biggies, the idea of cause and effect. Now this, of course, is an important one. We want to know, where did I come from? Where did the world come from? Why does the world work the way that it does? So all of these causal questions, and cause and effect as an assumption underlies all of our approaches to the sciences as we're trying to work out causal laws. So this notion of cause and effect that we often get to very quickly, what is this notion of cause and effect? It's closely tied to the concept of identity, that things have an identity, that they are what they are. Sometimes we say they have a particular nature, and we assume that things have, say, more or less stable identities that persist across time, and that so that we can then talk about how things are what they are across time, and when they change, understand the causal nature of that change. And that's what we're trying to do philosophically, sometimes theologically, and certainly scientifically. Now, let's plunge in and read some Hume here. "'Tis only causation which produces such a connection as to give us assurance from the existence or action of one object that 'twas followed or preceded by the existence or action. Nor can the other two relations ever be made use of in reasoning, except so far as they either affect or affected by it. There is nothing in any objects to persuade us that they are either always remote or always contiguous, and when from experience and observation we discover that their relation in this particular is invariable, we always conclude there is some secret cause, which separates or unites them." Okay, pausing there. That's a dense passage. Let's talk in terms of a particular example. So suppose I say, here I have my hand, and I have an impression of my hand, you have an impression of my hand, it is here now. Now I have my other hand, and it is here now, and I have impressions of both of them. And then I will continue to have impressions of them, so I turn them this way. Now I have an impression of this hand moving toward this hand, and I'm going to do something there. Now then we say, ooh, then there was a new impression. There was an impression of sound, and there was an impression of movement, and there was an impression of two things that I call hands. And then on the basis of those impressions, I want to say something like, this hand, when it moved and hit this hand, caused the sound to occur. And notice, there's that word, cause. Now, Hume asks us, what do we mean when we say cause? Because it doesn't seem like there is an impression of causation. What we have is an impression of hands, we have an impression of movement, and we have an impression of sound. That's what we actually have impressions of. But I don't have an impression of something else called a cause. So that happens, yes, but there's no like additional thing, little flag that pops up or little sign that pops up and say, this hand caused the sound to emerge when it hit against this other hand. That seems to be something that is added. Now, what we can then say is, well, if it's added, then it's not an impression, and it violates the empiricist criterion of meaning. What do we actually do? It's just a subjective thing that we are putting out there. Or if we really just want to say, well, what we mean by this word cause just is things moving and interacting with each other, then it seems kind of redundant, and we should just reduce the word cause to things moving in certain ways, or things being in certain time and place positions, but not see it as something additional. So this is this point about the secret cause that he wants to go on there. So there's not just this movement, but that this caused a certain sound. And then sometimes we want to go on and have big generalizations about the nature of sound and have all kinds of causal scientific principles that we are articulating here. But what Hume is arguing here is, if we have to start talking about secret causes, that is to say, these are then causes that we don't have impressions of, that violates the empiricist criterion of meaning. We don't really know what we are talking about. So maybe we should not use cause and effect language if that is the case. Now, the same then he goes on to say about the concept of identity. The same reasoning extends to identity. We readily suppose an object may continue individually the same, though several times absent from and present to the senses, and ascribe it to an identity, notwithstanding the interruption of the perception, whenever we conclude that if we had kept our eye or hand constantly upon it, it would have conveyed an invariable and uninterrupted perception. But this conclusion, only beyond the impression of the senses, can only be founded on the connection of cause and effect. Right, so let's try an example here. So I will put my hand up here. So right now I have an impression of my hand. You have an impression of my hand. Now I'm going to move my hand down here. We don't have an impression of the hand anymore, neither of us. Now I bring my hand back up and I say things, and probably you will say things like, it is the same hand. It is the identical hand. It continued in existence even when I didn't have an impression of it. Now, then Hume asks us to unpack what does that mean? What does it mean? There's the word meaning, right? What does it mean to say that something exists when I don't have an impression of it? Well, if I don't have an impression of it, how can I know that it exists? How can I make sense of the idea of things existing that I don't have impressions of? Again, we're into hocus pocusy kind of language. We're assuming that there's some sort of identity or essence, right, or whatever it is, or continuity out there independent of any of my impressions. But if my knowledge is based only on my impressions, then I can't just be adding stuff because I'm being sloppy in my thinking. Or I might then say, well, things have essences, or they have natures, or they have identities, and these persist, and these underlie various causal relationships and so forth. But all of that I don't have impressions of, and so it violates the criterion of meaning. So identity as a concept or as an idea is in trouble. Is that a meaningless concept? Cause and effect, the same thing. Now, what about generalizations where we want to say, well, this happened this time and then it happened again, and then we go to big, whopping generalizations. So I have a sample of copper, to take a scientific example, and I subject it to heat, and I have a thermometer, and I keep track of when that sample of solid copper starts to melt, and I notice that the copper melts at a certain temperature, and so I write that in my lab book, and maybe I run the experiment a couple of times, and then I do a big generalization. So there, copper melts at whatever temperature. I'm just going to make up a number, 800 degrees Celsius. So that's probably much too high, but anyways, but then what I'm saying is all of the copper in the world always melts at that particular temperature. So I'm assuming that copper has a particular identity and that the same causal factors hold across all of the copper, including all of the copper that I have not observed, and all of the copper across all time, but I have not existed across all time. So I'm going to big generalizations, and what in fact is the empirical, experiential, or impression basis of all of this. So this is the nature of our inductive generalizations. 'Tis therefore by experience only that we infer the existence of one object from that of another. The nature of experience is this. We remember to have had frequent instances of the existence of one species of objects, and also remember that the individuals of another species of objects have always attended them, and have existed in a regular order of contiguity and succession with regard to them. Thus, we remember to have seen that species of object we call flame, and to have felt that species of sensation we call heat. We likewise call to mind their constant conjunction in all past instances. Without any further ceremony, we call the one cause and the other effect, and infer the existence of the one from that of the other. And then what we then are doing in this particular example is to say, okay, so I see flame, and I put my hand close to the flame, and I have a sensation of heat. So I am connecting those two impressions, the sight of flame and the feeling of heat, and because they are connected to each other as impressions. But then I'm adding this other concept of causation, right? That the one impression, or the one thing that I had an impression of, caused the other thing that I had an impression of. And we don't really have an impression of that. But then if we want to go on and we say we do that a few times, and then we have this more general idea of flame, and we connect it to this more general idea of heat, and then we do a big generalization and we say flame causes heat in all cases, in all times, and so forth. And that's the without further ceremony. We've got to this great, big, whopping generalization. But that is problematic according to the empiricist criterion of meaning. And instead, if we were more careful, right, we would recognize that we are making this very slippery, too quick move. If reason determined us, that is to say, if we were strictly rational, it would proceed on that principle that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the very course of nature continues always uniformly the same. And that is problematic, because if we are talking about instances of which we have had no experience, well, what does that mean? That's not something that we have experience of. So how can we have an idea of it? So how can we say it's meaningful, much less go on to say that it is true? And that the course of nature continues always uniformly. That nature is uniform everywhere, including the places of which I have had no impressions. And that it is always, back in the past, of which I had no impression, that it will be so in the future, of which I have no impression. What can we, if we were strictly rational, even say that this is a meaningful thing? Now, Hume then goes on to do the same thing, not only to the notions of causation, identity, and then now generalizations, making them suspect. But the very idea of there being an external world, what do we typically mean by that? Well, I have these impressions, and I've got this idea that these impressions are coming from something that is doing the impressing upon my senses. So I've got me, and then I've got the world. And there's a kind of an in here and an external world. And then we go on to say things like, the external world exists even when I am not aware of it. And I know this, and I believe this. But what does it mean to say that there are things that exist that I don't have an awareness of? What I am aware of is things, when we use this in and out language, in my mind. Or I've got these various ideas in my soul that I am now reflecting upon. And then I say that there is something out there that I do not have an impression on that is the ultimate source of that. But that seems like, again, a problematic notion. Now, even though if we go inside and we start talking about the nature of the self, this mind or this soul, and again, we use things like we say, well, my mind caused these ideas, or that my memory has certain causal properties. And it stores various things, and I can put them together in various ways, and that there's an I, right, or a self that has a nature or an essence that is doing all of this stuff. And then Hume will ask the same question, well, what do we mean when we use this notion of an I that is having all of these impressions, or this self that is taking this impression and putting it together with that impression to make a new compound impression, say? If this is a meaningful term, then I should, according to empiricism, have an impression of it. So if I say my mind's eye, right, or I turn inwardly, or I try to introspect and see what is this impression, and then what Hume will point out is that we don't actually have an impression of a self. Instead, what we have is a whole bunch of impressions. So I'm thinking about this idea, or I am attending to, using my eyes, that particular thing, and there are certain impressions on my eyes. So I might say, I'm having those impressions, and those remind me of this. And then I'm going to take that impression and integrate it with this idea to form this new inference over here. So all of those impressions are before my mind, but I don't actually have an impression of the mind or the I or the self itself that's supposed to be doing all of these things. So is that even a meaningful notion? And if I can't find an impression to give basis of that, that then is another notion that I have to set aside as something meaningless. Now, another aspiration of modern philosophy had been to say that morality itself can be something rational. It should not just be a bunch of principles that are taken on faith from some religious source or from some authoritarian source, or just something that we habitually do because mommy and daddy told us we're supposed to be rational beings that can understand the nature of moral principles and perhaps even devise them for ourselves and become self-governing individuals. So part and parcel of this modern aspirational understanding of human beings as rational beings has been to rework our understanding of the basis of morality. And so morality is not just religious faith or mystical insights or matter of habits and duties and so forth. Moral principles can be shown rather to be rational. Hume also wants to take up this new modern project. The question here he's raising about whether moral principles can be based in reason. And sometimes this is phrased in terms of is and ought, that what we can do is say, this is the way the world is, and therefore, given the way the world is, we can make normative conclusions about how things ought to be, and use our factual understanding of the world to guide us toward certain ideals or certain normative outcomes that we think are desirable. And what Hume is going to do is skeptically divorce both of those, or reverse the order in some cases. And so in the treatise there is this very important section called Moral Distinctions Not Derived from Reason. And there's a very famous passage where Hume comments on his readings in moral philosophy. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. So this is very important, and there's a sneaky move or a subtle move, or a move that even the authors are not quite aware of, that they're making themselves, between talking about their ideas in very different ways. This is the way it is, this is the way it is, this is the way it is, and now suddenly I'm talking about this is how it ought to be. Or this is, there's this behavior, this is this behavior, this is this behavior, and this is how behavior ought to be. Right? Or this is the way the world is, to this is how the world should be. How do you make the move from one kind of language to that other kind of language? And normally in logic we want to say you can't have anything in your conclusions that isn't in your premise. So if we're going to say there are all of these oughts and shoulds and so forth, then those need to be in our premises. Or if they are going to be legitimate ideas, oughts and shoulds, and all kinds of value concepts, then we should have impressions of them. So when we are looking at the world, we should be able to see goods, oughts, and standards or normative principles, right, or whatever it is. And Hume is going to argue we do not. There's something slippery that is going on. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained. Right? So if, for example, to make up an example of, say, I'm watching a lion chase a zebra, and so I describe the lion is running, the zebra is startled, the zebra is running away, the lion is running faster than the zebra, the lion jumps on the zebra squeals, the lion snarls, the lion kills the zebra, the lion eats the zebra. Okay, so I'm doing all of these descriptive statements or factual statements or is statements about what has happened. Now, if I then want to say, that's bad for the zebra, well, where is this badness that I am talking about? I don't see badness there. There's no little flag that pops up or a little sign that pops up and says there's additional bad. And there's nothing beyond zebra startled, zebra running, zebra eaten that is bad. It's either just another description, but we don't use the word bad that way. We have it as having some additional significance beyond the factual statements. And Hume is saying, if that is the case, then that is illegitimate. And the same thing on the other side. If we want to say good for the lion, right, or that the lion ought to chase the zebras, and we're trying to give advice to lions in some respect, that sounds like it's a meaningless kind of proposition. There's no goodness out there beyond the statements of what is just factually going on. So it seems like, again, we've got these meaningless normative concepts that we are just slipping in all over the place. So the distinction of virtue and vice is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is it perceived by reasons. These seem to be different kinds of words that we are, again, either sloppily or meaninglessly introducing into the conversation. So, morality, then, at least as we typically do it, seems also to be suspect according to the empiricist criterion of meaning. Now, what about the big one, the existence of God? Now, Hume is an atheist. He does not believe in the existence of God. Now, we might expect him in the treatise concerning human nature to take up this issue explicitly, and to apply a certain, well, I don't see God, I don't have any direct evidence of God, etc., etc. But Hume seems to have been quite careful not to talk very much at all about religion in the treatise. He does talk about it in later works, and he does not address the issue issue of God directly, at least not to my knowledge, in the treatise. So for Hume's arguments that the concept of God is meaningless, that the arguments for the existence of God are invalid and unsound, go to his later works in Inquiry concerning human understanding and the dialogues concerning natural religion, which I was published actually posthumously. So what we then have is a set of skeptical conclusions that we have reached, where we have set aside not as untrue, but as even more fundamentally meaningless concepts. All of these very basic and ubiquitously used concepts in the history of philosophy. We think things that have a constant identity across time. We think that cause and effect are relations. We think that things exist independently of our awareness of them. We think that we have a self that is more or less stable underlying the flow of impressions. We think that moral concepts are meaningful and significant, and what we found is very corrosively this strict nominalist empiricism that Hume is articulating here undermines all of them and leads us to be skeptical about whether they are even meaningful in the first place. Nonetheless, we do use these concepts all the time in our daily life, and even philosophers who are trying to be very careful slip into them and use them everywhere or almost everywhere in their writing. So if these do not have their source in the impressions that come to us, where do they have their source? And there's one just passing mention in Hume, this line here. There is this gentle force which commonly prevails, which is to say that if it is not coming in any, we don't find them intrinsically out there or objectively out there, that in some sense we subjectively are adding them. Hume seems to make this suggestion here that it is a subjective addition, that there's this force that's operating inside of us that connects all of these things, puts them together in various categories, always, such that we subjectively can't help but think in terms of them. But again, if they're not from out there, then they must be from in here. I want to flag this. This is not a suggestion that Hume, to my knowledge, develops very much, but it does become significant when we jump into the next generation, particularly in the case of Immanuel Kant, where Kant does want to argue that cause and effect and all of these other concepts and so forth are not known to be out there, but rather that we have these subjective forms of sensibility and categories of the understanding right in our minds or in our subconscious minds that is doing all of this forcing and putting things together in various ways to present to our minds. That approach, that revolutionary approach, what Kant calls his Copernican revolution, there might be a hint or a suggestion of that in David Hume in the previous generation, but I don't want to make too much of that at this time. So now we have the big philosophical question. If we are human beings, and perhaps we are human beings who are of a somewhat philosophical temperament, what should we be doing with our lives? What is the role of philosophy in our lives, particularly now if we follow Hume and it seems like we're using all of these meaningless concepts and there's no way to get around it. So we seem to be in this very skeptical state as a result of taking empiricism and nominalism very seriously. This skeptical doubt is a malady which can never be radically cured. So let's pause at that point there, which is to say, it is something that cannot be cured. Hume sees no way out of this skepticism, and it is a malady. It's a bad thing. It's an unpleasant thing. It's a sickness, right, of some sort. So philosophy, it seems, leads us to this sick malady place that we call skepticism, and there is no way out. Hume's intermediate conclusion. So the only way we can get out of this then, picking up the quotation again, carelessness and inattention alone can afford us any remedy. That is to say, against all those philosophers that say philosophy in some sense will give us meaning and truth and significance, and we should be more philosophical in our lives. Hume's suggestion here is that we should care less about philosophy. We should be inattentive. That is to say, we should not pay attention to philosophy. That is the only remedy. We should lead an aphilosophical life or an aphilosophical life. For this reason, I rely entirely upon them and take it for granted, whatever may be the reader's opinion at the present moment, that an hour hence he will be persuaded that there is both an external and an internal world. So it's only to the extent that we stop, in this present moment, we're doing philosophy and getting ourselves into all of these skeptical boxes. In an hour, when we stop doing philosophy, everything will get back to normal, back to natural, unphilosophical life, and we'll start using all of those concepts again. So what this then seems to indicate is that we should set philosophy aside as a discipline, that it seems to be not only pointless, but actually detrimental to going about living our lives. Most fortunately, this other passage here, since it happens, right, that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing the spent of mind or by some avocation and lively impression of my ascensions which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends. And when, after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any further. So the cure for philosophy, which is supposed to be about being rational, but being rational means following the empiricist nominalist approach, is completely pointless. The cure to that is to set it all aside and just go on with living one's natural life in an unphilosophical way. And to raise one other important issue here, what does it mean to live in the natural way? It means, according to Hume, not to follow reason and reasoning too much, or certainly not to give them pride of place, as many philosophers in the Enlightenment tradition and some of the classical traditions would have us. Now, there is this outstanding, long-standing, issue in philosophy about the relationship between our passions and our reasons, or our minds and our emotions, or the logical faculty and the passionate faculty, and so forth. Some want to argue that they should work together harmoniously. Others want to say that reason and the passions are different and that they are in collision with each other. But if they are on the side of reason, what they then say is you have to control your passions and try to limit your passions, because reason should be the dominant faculty and your passions should follow along. Hume wants to set aside both of those traditions. It's not only false that nature and reason should be opposed to each other in the first place, but rather it should be that nature, our natural passions, should come first. Reason should accept itself as secondary and following along and doing what the passions want. That's what it is to live a natural life. And he puts it very strongly here. We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion and reason. So that's not a proper term. Instead, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve or obey them. If we follow reason, then we end up in skepticism, which undermines living one's life. So don't follow reason in that way. If we think reason is in conflict with our passions and we make reason primary, then again, we are going to be undermining that which makes it possible for us to live a good natural life. So instead, we should see first and foremost that we are creatures of passion, accept that, live our natural passionate life, and see reason as a tool a slavish tool to help our passions go the direction that they want. So, just a quick summary of all of this here. What we then have is 9 major philosophical issues, all of which Hume wants to argue are myths in a more pejorative sense, that these are just meaningless concepts that are not based in impressions, and if we try to philosophically make sense of them, we are going to get nowhere. Cause and effect, identity, the self, the existence of abstract ideas, the existence of inductive generalizations, that there's an external world, that morality is based on reason, that all ought follows from is, and the existence of God. We haven't argued that last one, but it is part of Hume's skeptical philosophy. Hume, philosophically, is a skeptic about all of those with respect to taking seriously empiricism and conjoining it with nominalism. So, if that is the proper estimation of where philosophy leads us, what we should do by and large is recognize that there is no objective source for all of these ideas. We do have these ideas in our minds, but in some sense we are adding them subjectively. It may be this gentle force inside our minds, it might be our passions, it might be part of our minds. That needs further discussion, but we are adding all of those concepts. They are not rationally, logically, empirically based. We should understand that we are first passionate creatures, creatures of emotion, desire, and so forth, except that they are prior to reason. Reason should be the slave of them, and that we should then set aside philosophy because it is opposed to living the natural life. Go forth and live a natural, passionate life.